The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
This pandemic has changed how most of us do many things in some pretty dramatic ways, getting from point A to point B among them. Tonight, a look at cycling and why it's proving that it's ready to play a bigger part in our transportation future after COVID-19 fades away. Up first, we'll explore how urban design has helped perpetuate racial inequality and where some more thoughtful city building could produce better, more equitable cityscapes for all. It's Thursday, June 18th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. We are living in historic times when it comes to reckoning with anti-Black racism, and one area ripe for further consideration is whether the way we design our cities actually perpetuates the inequality we're now trying to stamp out. We have two guests tonight who say, yes, urban design matters greatly, and they've got some ideas to share. So let's welcome, in South Los Angeles, California, Tamika Butler, formerly the executive director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, now principal and founder of Tamika L. Butler Consulting. And in Kensington Market in the provincial capital, Jay Pitter, placemaker and co-editor of Subdivided, City Building in an Age of Hyperdiversity. She's the John Bousfield Distinguished Visitor in Planning at the University of Toronto. And despite the fact that these two are on opposite coasts in two different countries, they have actually collaborated a great deal across North America on reimagining our urban spaces. And I'm really grateful to both of you for joining us here on TVO tonight. Jay, we're calling this discussion Urban Design is Not Neutral. So let's start there. How is urban design not neutral?
So urban design either perpetuates urban inequity or it can actually resolve urban inequity. And that particular principle is so important for every single urbanist to understand.
Tamika, I can just imagine people already saying, wait a second, if an intersection, for example, is poorly planned, and if a car comes flying through it, driving very unsafely, the driver's going to kill a white pedestrian whose nose is in his BlackBerry just as much as a Black person whose nose is in his or her BlackBerry. So how does, just help us understand this better, how does urban design contribute to racism?
Well, the thing a lot of people don't realize is that Black people are actually more likely to be hit. And part of that is that they're more likely to live in communities that have bad urban design, but also just in studies, when cars are driving, they are less likely to stop for Black people than they are for white people. And so part of it is just the anti-Blackness inherent in the world makes that true. But we also have to think about where we spend our resources. And the reality is every community, no matter where you are in North America, have the haves and the have-nots. And it's more likely to be low-income people of color who live in the have-not neighborhoods, and they lack well-lit intersections, well-painted and easy to spot crosswalks. And so the decisions we make with our budgets impact this.
Jay, you kind of set up this problem in a piece that you called, well, it's called A Call to Courage, an open letter to Canadian urbanists. It's a discussion paper that came out just this month, and I want to read a little excerpt from that again to help set up our conversation to come. Anti-Black racism, you write, is lodged deep within the foundation of Canadian cities. We have a history of slavery here that thrusts Black people into this country's social and economic margins. Later, segregation laws preventing Black people from freely accessing skating rinks, swimming pools, and entertainment spaces further cemented the divides. Black people were denied equal access to colonial land grants restricted by race, and municipal covenants prohibited Black people from living in many Canadian neighborhoods. One such covenant, only recently voided in the city of Vancouver, read, "No person of the African or Asiatic race or of African or Asiatic descent, except servants of the occupier of the premises and residents, shall reside or be allowed to remain on the premises." Racist covenants are not specific to Vancouver. There are many across Canadian cities that need to be formally voided. How much of that historic discrimination that you just described there do you believe persists today?
It is absolutely, it persists today because, again, it's written into policies and laws and guidelines that are predominantly invisible. So a lot of urbanists and also urban dwellers don't even realize that we have this history and that it is extraordinarily systemic. Oftentimes, when we talk about, anti-Black racism or racial equity, we're generally talking about it within a public health conversation or a social equity conversation. We don't generally have good language and precedent for spatializing these issues. And so it is so important to recognize that we have policies that need to be voided, that there were approaches that were taken in terms of urban design, such as weaponizing car-centric infrastructure against Black communities like Africville and Hogan's Alley, which pierced the hearts of those communities, causing disbursement, a large population of Black people being thrust into public housing. And we still see an overrepresentation of Black people in public housing today. We see an overrepresentation of Black people in our shelter system, in the foster care system, particularly folks from LGBT plus Black communities as well. And so we can trace a direct line between the overrepresentation of Black people within, housing and being targeted in public transit, right back to these early laws and restrictions.
Okay, but Tamika, again, I want to make sure we're not preaching to the choir here. I want to try to reach the people for whom this moment in history is sort of an opening. It's an awakening. It's a moment where they're thinking about these issues perhaps for the first time. And I can again imagine them saying, "Wait a second, we don't have apartheid in our public skating rinks anymore. We don't have, apartheid in our public swimming pools. Nobody's forced to sit in the balcony of a theater or a cinema anymore. So really, what's this about?" What would you say to that person who thinks that?
So I think to the person who thinks that, and particularly if they're not Black, I would first say, who are the Black people in your life that you know? And unfortunately for many people, they realize they don't know any. And when you say, well, why don't you know any? They say, well, you know, they don't go to school with my kids, or we're not on the same, hockey teams, or I just don't see Black people every day, right? And part of that is because of segregation. We've gotten used to not seeing Black people unless they're doing things like, driving our cars or serving us at restaurants. And so first you have to ask yourself, who's in my life? And then if you actually have a community that is diverse and rich, and you have Black people in your life whom you are close to and you trust, you should ask them if they feel like there is still a system of when they go to a restaurant, they might be treated differently, of when they're at a store, whether or not people suspect them differently. I am married to a white woman who is Canadian, who is French Canadian, right? Whose parents grew up in Montreal and lived most of their adult life in Toronto, and we still have family in Ontario, and we visit all the time. And I am treated differently. So someone who experiences what it is like to be Black in Canada quite frequently, for folks who are just awakening, what I would say is you have to believe those of us who have been living this and are not just awakening. And then once you believe us, you have to ask yourself, what can I do to help?
Well, all right. To that end, Jay, for the reasons that you've described here, that you've both described here, there are, and let's just take the capital city of Ontario. There are neighborhoods in the capital city of Ontario that are predominantly Black, and there are neighborhoods in this city where there are very few Black people living. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
That's a terrible thing, Steve. And we generally don't talk about segregation within a Canadian context, which is a part of the reason that I think it's so important for Tamika and I to be on the show this evening. We know that Holchansky released a report last year showing that we actually in 2020 are socially and segregated in this country by class and race. So this is not something that is just from the past. We have research and data showing that our neighborhoods are deeply divided by race and class. And I really want to go back to the built environment and infrastructure, because to be super clear, the call to courage that I made is not a call to return to some sort of diversity 101 training. It is not a call to put white people in a really hot room until they cry and, proclaim their white privilege. This is not useful at all. I'm not interested in that. I am really interested in how the policies and the decisions that we make about places impact the lives of people. And so what we do know is that racialized people living outside of the downtown core do not have equal access to public transit. They also have poor street infrastructure. They don't have the same access to green space. These realities built into infrastructure impact people's health, their mental health, and their ability to navigate the city freely. And it's no accident that a lot of civil rights movements were centered around public transit and access to public transit. And a lot of elite mainstream urbanists advocating for bike lanes, advocating for better transit, tend to advocate from the downtown core. And so this is how this issue is continuing to be perpetuated. So I just want to really draw a very clear line here between interpersonal and systemic and infrastructure. I really want to focus on systems and infrastructure today. I think that's so important. Because,
sure,
it's really nice. Like if my neighbor across the hall, who is a different race than me, it would be lovely if they greeted me. If they do not, oh, well, I'm a delightful person. I have friends. I was a popular kid. This is not what this is about. What this is about is I want to make sure that Black people and racialized people living outside of the downtown core can get a bus. Like get on a bus and not have to wait 40 minutes because bus service is so inferior outside of the core than it is downtown, right? And I want to make sure that when they get on that bus, that they are not profiled and targeted on their way to accessing, jobs and social opportunities. And the truth is that we have data that shows that Black people are more targeted on public transit. When walking down streets, Black people are more targeted. So when my colleagues are advocating for expanding streets and expanding sidewalks, obviously I support them in that. But my question to them is, do you also care about making sure that streets have a social culture and a social contract where Black men are not murdered on them? I want to also ask them if they are concerned about the fact that some children in this province, we have 40% of children living in Ontario live beneath the poverty rate. So I want bike lanes, but I also want those kids to be able to afford a bike. And so until we start thinking more holistically, we're going to, as urbanists, really miss the mark on having a complete conversation that centers urban equity.
No, I hear what you're saying, but Tamika, I'm willing to bet that the chief planners of the major cities across North America think that they are being very progressive and future-looking when they propose designs for changing cities to take advantage of social equity. Is it happening? I bet they think it's happening, but in your eyes, is it happening?
I think they're trying, and I think they're trying in many places for the first time. But as Jay said, we have to look at systems, right? Yes, we need individuals to stand up and say, I want to be an anti-racist and I don't want to be anti-Black. We absolutely need that, and I will never disregard that. But that doesn't mean just texting and calling and checking on your Black friends, or when you don't have Black friends, your Black colleagues. Like there have to be acknowledgments that there are systematic problems in the way things work. And that means that white folks are going to have to acknowledge that they've had power historically, and they have to cede some of that power. So the other thing I would bet is if we look at planning departments and transportation departments across North America, most of them are not run by Black people. Most of them are not run by people of color. Most of them are not run by women. Most of them are not run with people with disabilities or people who are LGBT. And so we have this huge profession, urban planning, city planning, land use, that has historically been held tightly by white men. And so when folks think, I want to do social justice or I want to do racial justice work, they think about criminal justice, they think about our education systems, but they don't realize that the way we build our cities, the way we plan our transportation, the way we literally decide who's going to live on the other side of the tracks and who's going to have mobility options that will then open up economic mobility. We don't understand that the people who have been holding those keys for generations don't look like me, don't look like Jay, don't have our same life experiences, and may be saying now, well, racism, well, equity, I want to check a box and doing what they think they can, but they're not truly interested in changing the way these decisions are made, how they engage with communities, and frankly, who they hire and who they put in positions of power.
Well, let's follow up, Tamika, with this, because I know Canadians have probably looked with a certain amount of sanctimonious smugness at the fact that there are statues, there are place names, there are street names in the United States, particularly in the Deep South, that tend to revere, what do we want to call them? Well, traitors. They were secessionists back in the 1860s. They were responsible for the Civil War. And we have always felt that that was, America's history, but not ours. And now we're just starting right now to understand that one of the longest streets in Ontario, Dundas Street, may be named after a guy who, never mind, was never here, but might not have satisfactorily been behind efforts to abolish slavery. We have a debate happening in the city of Kitchener right now, about a couple of hours from where I'm sitting right here, as to whether or not that name of that city ought to be changed again. Remember, it was Berlin during World War I, which was not a very popular name at the time, so they changed it to Kitchener. But now we find out that the British World War I hero Kitchener, may have established some extremely deadly concentration camps during the Boer War that killed tens of thousands of blacks. Tamika, question: how do we resolve these issues?
I think you're absolutely right. A lot of cities, in the United States and now in Canada are starting to look at these issues. And when we think about these people, I don't think of them just as, secessionists or traitors. I think of them as racist. And so I think that, yes, we should change the street names. We should take down the statues. If folks feel attached to them, put them in museums. We should change the name of our cities. But more than that, again, I don't want just performative changes. I want folks to say, what is it that made us think, and in Canada, what is it that made us think that slavery was a problem in the United States? And then there was this thing called the Underground Railroad, and Black people used it, and they came up north, and we treated them better. And that's just not true. And again, I have Black family members in Canada. And so we can't just change names and check boxes. We have to ask ourselves, when we didn't do that, why? What systems were in place that didn't make us consider racism is something that is a deal breaker, that didn't make us consider that when we looked around this table, we didn't see any Black people. And not just that we still have ownership of this table. Maybe this isn't the right table. Maybe there are tables elsewhere that we should be going to. And so I want all of those things changed, but I think as Black folks, we don't want this to just be a moment. There is an urgency because we are dying, and we are dying every day, and there is a genocide of our people all over the world. And so we want to know, what are we not just going to do symbolically, but what are we actually going to change in the systems? And that's why you keep hearing Jay and I coming back to some of these deeper things.
Well, this is where we try to figure out, Jay, just how far we should go. And, yes, George Washington was the father of America and the first president. But he owned slaves. So do you rename Washington, D.C.? Do you take his face off the $1 bill? Sir Johnny MacDonald is the father of our country. But his treatment of indigenous people, again, going back to the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, 80s, and 90s, would not stand up to scrutiny today. Do we take all the statues of Sir John A. down? Do we take him off the money? How do we resolve this?
So, Steve, as you know, I've done some deep work in the American South around Confederate monuments. And what is really key, I believe, is that I think it's kind of simplistic around changing names or taking it down or leaving things up. I think what is really important is to identify how to contextualize this history appropriately. So there are different schools of thought in Europe after World War II and just the genocide there of Jewish people. The decision was made to actually keep within the public realm symbols of that brutality so that people living in that city would never forget that history and so that it would never repeat itself. And so that's one school of thought. Keep the symbols there, but contextualize them socially and historically so that people understand what they mean and that they're not standing uncontextualized, celebrated as, iconic terrorism against people who suffered under the individuals who are being depicted in that work. So I think that's what is most important. I think context. I think that if we go ahead and change every single street name and take down every single monument, what we might do is actually erase our history and our complicity in racism and other forms of urban equity. So inequities, excuse me. And so in my experience, I have found that it's very important to have the people who are most impacted within their own local context have a robust conversation about how they want to see this context and this truth and reckoning revealed. And it's different across cities and it's different across groups. It's not prescriptive. And I think that's really important here. I just
So
want
if I
to
can do an
say,
example, I remember several years ago, I was in Ottawa and I had an hour to kill and I went to a cemetery and sure enough, there is the gravesite of the civil servant who was essentially the father of the residential school system. And on his headstone from back in the day, it talked about all the wonderful positions he had and what a lovely man he was, etc. But then there was another plaque beside it that had just been put in more recently, which really described, a lot of what he did and how horrible it was. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about when you talk about contextualizing?
it is exactly the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And I would even go a step further to say that it's not just about having a reckoning with these individuals. There was an entire society which held those values. So it's so easy to point at individuals. It's easy to point at police. We definitely need to have those very difficult conversations, but we need to have conversations about our collective values. These things happened because a lot of regular, everyday people stood by and co-signed it. And so that's also what we have to reckon with. We can't let ourselves off the hooks.
And
Okay,
I
I've
would
got a
just,
few minutes left. Yeah, Tamika, go ahead, please.
yeah, and I would just add, I think part of what Jay is saying is so important. When folks want to do anti-racist work or equity work, often what they're looking for is, tell me the outcome I should get to. Please, please, consultant, or please, Black person who's helping me, tell me what I should do. Should I take down the sign? Should I change the name? Should I change the dollar bill? Should I go to this event? Should I ask this question? And the reality is, this is about how you do what you do as much as the ultimate outcome of what you do. And that's what makes this work so hard. There's not one answer. There's not, if you get to this outcome, it works out. The reality is when people say, well, what's the toolkit on equity? What's the toolkit on being an anti-racist? There is no toolkit because in every community, it's going to be different. In every context, it's going to be different. With every person, it's going to be different. And that's what folks who aren't used to doing this work, who aren't used to living in Blackness day in and day out, don't understand. This is exhausting. This is tiring. When you wake up every day and you hear that there are nooses hanging, or another Black person shot, or another Black woman whose name we still can't say and we still can't seem to charge the people who killed her, this is a marathon. And folks who just want to do a quick sprint to the end are not going to make it because the marathon has to continue, is the great urban philosopher Nipsey said.
Okay, Tamil, we got a few minutes left here, and I want to focus that time we have left on one line in particular, Jay, that really struck me from your paper. And the line is, transformation cannot occur without radical truth-telling followed up with courageous action. Okay, we are clearly doing some truth-telling these days, maybe as, in ways we haven't since the 1960s. What's the courageous action that we need to follow that up with? Let me hear from each of you on that, maybe a minute and a half to each of you on that.
Okay, so as urbanists, what we need to do is look at the composition of people on our teams, and we need to create more space for individuals who have lived experience of poverty, disability, queerness, all of those things. We need to create space and invite people to bring their full selves to urbanism. There's no such thing as universal design or a design that is going to meet the needs of everyone. And so that begins by having more diverse teams, and it's not about simple representation like this many people who are Black and this many people who are disabled. It's about creating a culture where different perspectives can come forward. We also need to dismantle the idea of urbanist superstars. There are about 3 people in this country so enamored with the sounds of their own voices who constantly talk about, take the gardener down and expand these sidewalks. They need to shut up. Like, it's just too much. Everybody has heard those arguments. Black people, white people, Asian people, we're tired of it. Like, we need to have conversations where we bring more voices into the mix. So it's about having a conversation that is more nuanced with more voices and more perspectives. Another thing.
Okay, I got to jump in because I want to make sure we save time for Tamika. Go ahead,
Okay.
Tamika, you got the last minute here.
Sure. I would just say that we have to decenter whiteness. And I think that's really hard and people don't know what that means. But for instance, when we say we're in a moment and we're truth telling for the first time, who's the we? Because honestly, I think there have always been Black folks, or Indigenous folks, or again, people with disabilities, or LGBTQ plus folks who have been truth telling. But the folks who are saying we haven't been listening. And so for me, more than anything, we have to create space for those voices to be heard and then for action to happen. And so, as Jay said, those folks who have been taking up a lot of room and now want to say, well, we're doing this for the first time. Well, if you're the we and you're just doing it for the first time, then it's probably time to move to the side and let those of us who have been doing this work do this work, because this is going to be an opportunistic moment where a lot of people try to jump in, and those of us who have been doing this and who will be doing it long after this moment, those folks should be coming to the forefront.
I can't tell you how grateful I am to both of you for joining us on TVO tonight for some truth telling and some truth listening, I hope as well, from the people who are watching and listening to this right now. Tamika Butler, Jay Pitter, thanks so much to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Even before the summer weather arrived, the pandemic prompted a mass exodus from mass transit. Many of the folks turned to a tried and true mode of transportation, the trusty bicycle. And in some parts of the province, almost overnight, new road access has made cycling a whole new ballgame. Is a golden age of cycling a silver lining in this COVID-19 pandemic? Let's find out. We're welcomed in Little Portugal in Toronto by Yvonne Bambrick. She's Executive Director of the Forest Hill Village Business Improvement Area and the author of The Urban Cycling Survival Guide. In Little Italy, Toronto, Siva Vijayanthra, Project Manager at the city building nonprofit 880 Cities. And in Midtown Toronto, Beth Savin, Senior Lecturer Emeritus in Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. And we're delighted to have you three on our program tonight to talk about something that's, well, a lot more people are doing it these days, and let's find out if this is a temporary thing or a real thing. In cities around the world, the streets are being repurposed to accommodate the new physical distancing protocols. And I'm wondering, Beth, why don't you start us off here? What could cycling look like as we head into a post-pandemic reality?
Well, if all the measures are put in place, we could have the trips that are under 5 kilometers in Toronto, which is under 7 kilometers is roughly half the trips. We could have all of them undertaken by active transportation, by people cycling or walking. And if we have easy access to e-bikes, we could have a vast number of trips undertaken by bicycle, up to 2/3, maybe even more. So we could really revolutionize the way people get around the city, creating much greater health for the people cycling and for the people who aren't cycling, because dramatic decreases in air pollution have been noted around the world as cars have been taken off the streets by people observing lockdown. So this is a great opportunity, but it won't just happen automatically. We need to do things as cities, as citizens, and as advocacy groups also to help enable this very, very powerful demand for cycling.
And we shall discuss all of that over the next several minutes that we have here on TVO tonight. Siva, what do you see potentially?
What has been really inspirational and terrific about the response from municipalities during this pandemic is that we have seen that with the right resources and with the right political will, cities are able to act really quickly to create the kind of change that advocates and community members have wanted to see for a long time. So this bodes well if we continue seeing the importance of offering people transportation choice and transportation equity. We can continue building the kind of city that we'd like to see.
Well, Yvonne, I think I'm right in saying that here in the capital city of the province of Ontario, they've added 40 kilometers of bike lanes this year. That's in relatively short order. It's certainly the most in the city's history. It's been called bold by a lot of people. You think it's bold enough?
Well, slight correction. They've approved putting in place 40 kilometers. And having been here for a while, I'll say I'll believe it when I see it. We have begun. It is underway. And I'm obviously thrilled that we've moved forward and that council has found the value that will, this will serve all Torontonians. The thing about bike infrastructure that we forget is that it does serve everyone. So yes, it provides a safer place for people to feel confident to ride their bike for those short trips that Beth mentioned, but also it allows the roadways to work better. It brings predictability to an otherwise chaotic space where you have people trying to find space for themselves at the side of the road or anyway. So I do think it's a step in the right direction. I think when you compare us to cities like Montreal, who in the same time frame have approved 200 kilometers, it puts it into context. So great step forward for Toronto, but I think we can do more.
Beth, are you similarly concerned that you'll believe it when you see it?
Well, that's been the history here. And I, like Yvonne and Siva, I'm thrilled to see a much more unanimous level of support for cycling among the municipality. And I think that's terrific. But I do think we need to move quickly. And I think that we need to have a slightly different mindset. So some of the lanes that are being put in, they're terrific, but they don't necessarily mirror our TTC system. And one of the things that's becoming clear is that many would prefer to cycle rather than taking transit in the follow-up to this pandemic. And so we need to mirror those systems so that people who might formerly have taken the subway or the bus or the streetcar are able to follow those routes, but on a bicycle. And so if you look at the new active TO proposed network and combine that with what we already have, it's a bit of a hodgepodge of lanes throughout the city. And what we really need is connections so that people can mirror those transit routes and rely on safe, separated bike lanes that allow them to go everywhere they want to go, not just to work, but to the shops, to see their friends, for evening entertainment.
Siva, do you think most people in this province are looking at cycling differently now that we're in the midst of a pandemic?
I think that what the pandemic has allowed to happen is for the voices that we might not have heard before to come up to the forefront. So, I mean, the pandemic has allowed or has forced us to act to respond to some of the concerns that have existed for a long time. Advocates had been asking for a long time in a lot of different communities across the province, including in the suburbs, including in smaller towns, for more options. That they didn't necessarily move to a car-centric neighborhood because they preferred to drive. They moved to those car-centric neighborhoods because that might have been what was affordable. They might have been wanted to be closer to community, and they weren't given the option to choose active transportation if they wanted it. And so the pandemic has helped kind of crystallize that this is an underlying need that is now becoming a crisis point. So. So what's exciting about the move towards slow streets and creating more bike infrastructure is that it's actually answering something communities have latently wanted for longer than the pandemic.
I would assume, Yvonne, that given how nice the weather is right now, and given that more people are nervous about taking public transit these days, I would assume it's boom times for the biking business. Is that true?
It certainly is. Bike industry have been reporting, long wait times for maintenance because they've just got so many people who are pulling bikes out of basements, that kind of thing. But also the supply chains have been affected by the pandemic. And so while they're able now to restock, for a while there, we were running out of bicycles, which is, that's a pretty great news story. It really indicates that people felt the desire to buy a bike if they didn't already have one, or service one that had been just sat around waiting. People have the time to get more active. So we've seen an increase in recreational cycling, which is another reason why the active TO installation along the lakeshore and Bayview has been so important, and we need to expand that. We have people across the city want to be riding, and they don't necessarily want to have to come downtown to do that. But yeah, bike shops are booming, absolutely. And I feel like that's going to continue.
Does it disappoint you that it took a pandemic for us to kind of gain an appreciation, a bigger appreciation for cycling?
That's the thing. As Siva said, this has certainly highlighted what was already happening. It's sort of fast-tracked what was already there. People have wanted to ride. And now there's a necessity because of the perception that transit is not as safe as it once was. And already the transit system was under an awful lot of pressure to move many people. So as we come out of this and as people begin to move through the city for a variety of reasons, work, entertainment, family, etc., we really do not have the space to accommodate all those folks who are moving off of transit. If they choose cars, we're in real trouble. We had congestion problems before, and I don't think anybody wants to go back to that. So we need a connected network in all parts of the city for all demographics to feel safe on bicycles year round. So where we haven't necessarily done great in the past with the existing infrastructure that we have, which has been improving slowly, we have to quickly figure out a plan for year-round maintenance and for a rapid expansion of a network of bike infrastructure.
Well, I guess this all raises the issue of whether we have or need some kind of province-wide or even national active transportation strategy. Do we have it? Do we need it?
Just before the pandemic hit, Catherine McKenna's office, MP McKenna's office, announced that MP Andy Fillmore was going to be tasked with a national active transportation strategy. And obviously things have happened since then, but it's still in play. We're still sort of talking about that behind the scenes, and it is a tremendous opportunity to have leadership from the federal level to help municipalities and provinces across the country put in place the infrastructure needed to allow people this alternative year round. As I said, it's just so vital, and this is the moment for it.
Beth, maybe you could flesh that out a bit for us. What would that actually do to have that national transportation strategy in place?
Well, I think we need it at all levels. We did have something at the provincial level, which hasn't really been acted on recently. So I think we need it at all levels of government. And I think one of the things that both Siva and Yvonne have alluded to that could be especially emphasized in higher level strategies is the need for areas that are poorly served with other means of access to important destinations, to have preferential investment for active transportation. So we can see the pandemic has illuminated so many things that we knew about, but it sort of brought them together in very sharp relief. So we can see the areas now of the city where populations have been most vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus. And those areas happen to have very poor public transit and active transit access to destinations. So the bus service is poor. They aren't served by above ground light rail. And it's scary to cycle and even to walk in many of those neighborhoods. And so we need to really look at the areas that are least served, where people don't have the option often to take a car or transit, and really focus on those. And so higher level plans can talk about that in forcefully. And also we need to look at smaller towns, at villages, at rural areas. We need to look at integrating active transportation with other forms of transportation. So in many parts of the world, when people commute long distances or need to travel long distances, they don't drive right into the city. They may drive from point to point if there's no other method to get from A to B, but they leave their vehicles at the perimeter of the city or town that they go to. And from that point on, they have access to bicycles. And I think that that's something that could greatly benefit Canada. What I also want to emphasize is that e-bikes are going to really change the way we travel, because they allow people to go up hills. You can arrive at your destination without having broken a sweat. And that can be good, depending on where you're going and who you're meeting. They allow people to travel much farther. And so I'm very happy to see that Bike Share is adding more stations and also adding some e-bikes. But I think we're going to need a lot more of that.
Sure. I do have to ask Siva, though, about this. And how do I put this? You know, trying to integrate cars and bicycles and pedestrians and I don't know what else, people on skateboards or little scooters or Vespas, or I mean, this is a real challenge if you're trying to plan a transportation system. And I know, I mean, I haven't had the car out of the driveway maybe twice in the last 3.5 months, but I do know, I probably speak for many people in my demographic when I say it's a little terrifying right now, not being able to see cyclists coming up from behind you, particularly if you're trying to make a right-hand turn and there's a bike lane there, and making it all work. So I need to get a better understanding, Siva, of how cycling can be better integrated into the entire transportation system. Because right now, I'm sure of course, there's terrified cyclists about getting hit, but I think there's scared drivers too, who are worried that they just can't see cyclists coming quickly enough.
That's a really good point, and that's why the most advanced versions of bike infrastructure include design types like protected intersections, which guide people into turning in ways that separate out different types of traffic and protect pedestrians and cyclists and people in their cars. But I think that part of thinking about the integration of active transportation into everyday life also involves making sure that, like Beth was saying, making sure that there's access to bike share or low cost bikes in communities that could use bikes to get to a transit stop, for example. And not just always thinking about how people driving might interact with people on bikes, but also thinking about the fact that in the suburb of Scarborough, for example, 25% of households don't have a car. There are huge numbers of people in the city already who don't drive, and across the province as well. But if we really focus in on some of our racialized suburbs, there are swaths of the population where either the entire household doesn't have a car, or they have one car and that's used by one member of the household, while the other members, including often, obviously, children who don't drive, they also need options to be able to get around their neighborhoods in a safe way that keeps them connected. And I think what the pandemic has really demonstrated to us is how important it is to feel connected to our neighbors, and at the same time to be able to to physically distance for our own safety. And older people are at the most risk of being socially isolated. So if we can create safe infrastructure where a child or an older person, and that's kind of the philosophy of 880 cities, where both those demographics can safely ride to their destinations, then we're creating a city that's great for everyone. And coupled with that, we also have to think about what those destinations are, and we have to recognize that, again, the most racialized parts of the city or the most racialized parts of the province are also the least likely to have close at hand destinations. They might need to use motorized vehicles to get to the grocery store or the clinic because there just isn't that resource close to their own neighborhood. So part of building active transportation infrastructure has to involve equitable community planning and making sure that we are creating neighborhoods where everyone can walk or bike to get to where they need to go.
Well, let me do a quick follow-up with you, Siva, because that anticipates my next question, which is this a conversation that people basically in Midtown or downtown Toronto or Ottawa or Hamilton, I mean, obviously they can have it in densely populated parts of the province, but what about Scarborough? What about the north end of Etobicoke? What about, more inner suburbs in Ottawa? What about Barhaven? Are people, is cycling an option in those parts of the province, and do strategies take that into account?
I think that cycling, a lot of people would like cycling to be an option, and I think it's hard for it to be an option for a lot of people. If you look at North Etobicoke, there are huge numbers of teens riding bikes already in the parking lots of the malls there, and there are seniors riding on sidewalks to get around. And the best programs that have emerged in the last couple of decades, and especially in the last few years, have really integrated cycling as a form of community health. So they've put community bike hubs and partnered them with community health clinics. A couple of examples in the suburbs specifically are the Brampton Bike Hub, which is partnered with the Punjabi Community Health Services. And that is a situation where the doctors and healthcare workers who know the community are able to connect them with this community building opportunity that also gives them the chance to benefit from the physical health and mental health benefits of cycling. A lot of in some of the suburban areas where there might be multifamily homes, we're seeing a lot of seniors who spend most of the time at home by themselves because part of the reason they're living with their families is to offer childcare, and when schools start up again and when people start maybe going to the office again, a lot of those seniors will once again be alone in their homes. And we've seen in other cities that when bike lanes are put in, for example, in the Montreal suburb of Saint Laurent, my auntie, who's in her 60s, rides a bike to get to see her friends. And that's been happening in Brampton. It's been happening at the Scarborough bike hubs. And for a couple of decades, it's been happening in South Riverdale with the South Riverdale Community Health Center. So these are some of the examples of ongoing programs that we can now build on when we recognize that the pandemic is a health issue in terms of it's obvious. Obviously, the pandemic is a health issue, but also the underlying or the associated health effects of social isolation and a lack of exercise. That we can think about addressing it with active transportation as part of our health solution.
Well, this is where I come in and say, Yvonne, on the other hand, you're the head of the Forest Hill Business Improvement Area, and to the best of my knowledge, most businesses are not crazy about the idea of bike lanes coming in and potentially taking away parking spots from customers that they hope to have, particularly at this time when most of them are, they're in an existential crisis for the future of their businesses. How do you square that circle?
Well, two things. Yes, it's a very trying time for Main Street business. But that said, I think there's a shift, definitely, thanks to some of the research work that's been done by folks like Beth around who actually shops at local businesses and how they arrive there. So I think that's starting to shift amongst business owners. And, transportation is one of the key functions of our cities and our towns. We have to be able to get around. We have to get to our shops and schools and work, and we just don't have room for more cars. That's the bottom line. And putting infrastructure in place that allows people to cycle doesn't mean that you are then forced to use it. It just means that you have another option. And if more people are choosing that option, that's fewer people in a car looking for parking, or in that long line of cars in front of you that's created the traffic you're stuck in. So, bike infrastructure has been misunderstood, and the value of it has not been fully understood till now. And I think thanks to studies, we're starting to shift that perspective. But I think shops are happy to have shoppers, whether they arrive by car or on foot, or by bike. And most local shopping is done by people arriving on foot and by bike. We know this, and we just have to keep talking about it. And we have parking lots. I mean, not being able to find a parking spot in front of a local business is a problem, but you have to park on the far side of a mall parking lot and walk all the way into the mall, and that's not a problem. I mean, we have to reframe how we're looking at these things, and the expectation that there will be parking right in front of your destination is not necessarily realistic.
Beth, tell me if I've got this right, because I think you did some studies about the businesses on Bloor Street in downtown Toronto and when they put the bike lanes in and the impact that had on local businesses. Can you share some of that info with us?
I did do a study working with the Center for Active Transportation, and we've just published our results, led by, I'm very proud of a former student of mine, Daniel Arancibia, who really led that work intellectually. And we found that, like in every other study pretty well that's been done in North America and around the world, when bike lanes are put in, even if they remove parking from in front of Main Street businesses, the businesses are either not affected or they're positively affected by the installation of the bike lanes. This is universal. It happened on Bloor Street. We measured that. We could see that happening. We could see that compared to other areas, there was more purchasing happening on Bloor Street following the installation of those pilot bike lanes. But that wasn't a surprise. This is the case everywhere. And cyclists spend money locally. It's now been well demonstrated that they are a very prime customer demographic, and that it's going to serve businesses really well to attract them and to attract more of them. And unless a business is selling very large items that need to be delivered to the purchaser, and that can of course be done by delivery vans, then really mainstream businesses are going to benefit from bikes. And cyclists are great customers.
We're down to just the last few minutes here, and I want to get a couple of more items on the table if I can. Siva, to you on this one. I think the city of Hamilton basically just saved its bike share program because they got some private donations in there, so that helped. I think Toronto recently expanded its bike share programs to North York and to Scarborough. Does any of this stuff make a real difference?
I think it makes a huge difference. I think the only way to make a decision to choose to use active transportation is if the resources are available. So by creating safer streets, that's one avenue, but it has to be coupled with making sure that communities have access to bikes, and that's part of what bike share offers, and by making sure that communities also have access to education and community supports. And that's where programs like the really revolutionary Bike to School project, which teaches high school students how to ride safely in their own neighborhoods as part of their gym class, or where all these community bike hubs are creating community around riding bikes. And these are all part of an integrated plan that has to happen together to make sure that that people, again, have the choice, that it's about making sure that everyone can choose to bike if they want to.
Now, Yvonne, 100 years ago when I was a kid, there was a bit of stigma actually riding around town on a bicycle, because what it meant was, you weren't lucky enough to have a car. And I wonder whether there is still any social stigma associated with riding a bicycle today.
I mean, people make judgments all the time. Sadly, we like to judge others. It's not the best habit. But I think that the bike riding stigma has changed. It's definitely shifted. We've got, the business community in suits riding into the core. We did pre-pandemic. I think it depends also. There's a cultural lens there as well. People, if you're trying to make headway, your goal is to buy a car, and you're trying to show your wealth in different ways. You can show wealth with a fancy bike. And I think you see everybody on a bike now. You didn't used to see everyone on a bike. Now you're seeing seniors and kids and, someone wearing a very cool outfit. People see themselves represented on bicycles and now see it as more of an option than ever before. The bicycle's always been here. It's the single most helpful and joyful form of independent transportation. And I think people are starting to really understand its value, both in this pandemic context, but also just in their daily lives. The idea of being stuck in a car or on a crowded bus just was never particularly appealing, even less so now. And so the bicycle is basically a freedom machine, and you can personalize it. You are engaged in community when you're on a bike, but you can also be independent. You take your own route on your own timeline, and you always find parking, which is, well, almost always. When it's busy, it's hard to find parking, but that's the truth.
Freedom machine. That's a good one. I haven't heard that one before.
That's true.
The bike is a freedom machine. Good stuff.
And a time machine. It's a time saver.
Right on. Well, it's definitely that. You can definitely on most days get around faster on a bicycle than you can any other way. I want to thank you three for joining us on TVO tonight, and we'll keep watching to see whether or not this ushers in a new era, a new golden era of cycling post-pandemic. Thanks very much, you three.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, June the 18th, 2020. This weekend, we mark National Indigenous Peoples Day. And tomorrow, we'll look at two fascinating projects that map some of the history of Indigenous people over the past few centuries. Also, we've got an exit interview with outgoing OCAD University President Sarah Diamond, and we hope you'll be with us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.